I'm blanking on the fellow's name that's no longer here.
Caleb?
Caleb. Caleb's gone, right?
Yep.
So but he was the guy who asked me to show up today, so, and then, is it Della?
Yeah.
Made sure that I showed up. And so, the idea when Caleb talked to me, wanted to discuss cover crops and whatever we had going on lately. And I was here a few years ago and talked about a similar topic. But what I wanted to share today is some of the more recent work we've done over the last couple of years, 2-3 years, looking at soil water. And so, just talking to Lauren here about some of his experiences, he says a lot of times, see if this rings true with you, if it doesn't rain, it doesn't matter what you plant, right? And in some cases, if it does rain, it doesn't matter what you plant, right? It does well as well. And so that's kind of the background. That's a good thing to keep in mind as we think about these things. But we have been doing a lot of cover crop work over several years in Manhattan and a few other locations. I cooperate with some other folks. And so Maddie Kirkendall and David Abel were a couple of graduate students that helped with this particular work. And Gerard Klutenberg, he's another Dutchman that helps me with the soil water measurements. He's a soil physics guy. And if I turn this on, it would work better probably. Okay. So, kind of what we were saying, water's a kind of a big deal in our soils and in our cropping systems, right? That's one of the main limiting factors we're thinking about. And when we talk about crop water use, whether it's a cover crop or cash crop, wheat, corn, sorghum, soybeans, evapotranspiration is the term we're talking about that characterizes, that's the term they use for total crop use. And some of that's evaporation from the soil, that's the evaporation part, evapo. And some of it's transpiration. And what transpiration is the water that actually enters the plant roots, goes through the plant, and then out through the leaves. And that, in our conventionally tilled systems, there's a fair amount of evaporation early in the season, right? Before those plants get much size to them. And one of the benefits of no-till is you've got that residue out there minimizing those evaporative losses. But eventually, in either system, the plants get big enough, get leaf area, you've got a lot of transpiration going on. And so once you get a canopy, you no longer see between the rows. It's almost all transpiration, the water moving through the plant. And so this chart here shows that relationship. So this black line, that's the leaf area index, and that's just a way to measure the leaf area of a canopy. So the bigger that number, the more leaf area you have, right? And so if you think about a crop, it starts out small, you've got a small seedling. If it's corn or sorghum, it grows fast, puts out a lot of leaves, and so your leaf area increases and it peaks at around heading or tassel, and then it slowly backs off as those leaves senesce and die off at the end of the season, right? During grain filling. So that's leaf area, and these red dots in that line is transpiration. So that's on a daily basis. In other words, that's how much water is getting lost from that, through those leaves. You see how tight a relationship there is there, right? They almost exactly parallel each other. So the more leaves, more canopy you have out there, the more water you're chugging into the atmosphere. And that's one of the issues that we think about when we think about intensifying our systems or putting more crops out there, inserting cover crops between our cash crops, those kinds of things. So Lauren mentioned he's planting occasionally some forages after wheat harvest. Anybody else doing some cover crops, and where do you do it? Yeah.
We try to graze a lot of cattle. We plant, like where we chop solids, we put turnips and radishes and oats and rye usually.
Okay.
Try to get some fall growth of the oats. after the corn comes out, maybe just rye and turnips and radishes, and maybe in the spring we plant a few oats to graze. You know, just kind of, we plant some VMR sometimes for summer grazing if we need it.
If you can get it in early enough.
Yeah.
You're talking about an option in the spring here, you know, if you got some ground you want to get some more grazing, oats is a good spring option. Sometimes you can throw some brassicas, turnips or things in with that. Everybody grazing them? Pretty much. This is cow country up here, right? And so I appreciate that. And so I guess you just got to remember what I'm talking about today. We're not grazing these things, just for a number of reasons. One is I just wanted to look at the cover crop aspects. And the other is this just raises the complexity of research when you put animals out there in smaller plots. Now I do have a colleague that I'm starting to work more with out at Hayes, who's doing some similar type work, and he's got access to some land that they got a few years ago near Hayes. I forget the name of it, something ranch, but he's got big enough areas he can get cattle on those things and graze those things. So I'm hoping over time we'll get more and more of that kind of information out of his work. One of the things about grazing though is, hopefully we're getting some of these same responses even though you're grazing, right? Okay, so something we've been doing for a while here at Manhattan is a wheat, sorghum, soybean rotation. And this started in '07, and at that time we transitioned from conventional to no-till. So it's been continuous no-till ever since. And right between wheat and sorghum, we're doing stuff. This is where we're trying to fit some of our cover crops. And before I forget, I will say we've been through 3 cycles of this rotation now, so 9 years of the 3-year rotation. And we're changing it up a little bit, so some of the things we're starting to insert more here as well, just to try to get more intense in that system, intensity. So this is our check. We just killed the volunteer wheat and the weeds with, used to be glyphosate would do it for us the first few years. Now we've thrown in some paraquat and other things to try to take out those herbicide resistant weeds. Okay, we're also putting double crop soybean in there. Anybody do double crop soybeans occasionally? Depends on the year, right? I'm not going to talk about that very much today, but I would say average over years we've been, in the low 20 bushels per acre over the 9 years of the study. Some years we've got nothing. Last year it was like 50 bushels. Double crop beans, but it was a heck of a bean year last year, right? Who had the winning soybean yields in the county? Nobody's going to say a number? I heard 70, 80 bushel dryland beans around.
That's 74. Don't want to brag on.
You guys are also humble. So that's pretty good dryland beans though. And honestly, I was just looking at some data from down at Topeka, and their dryland beans out yield their irrigated beans by 10 to 15 bushel. But they've got terrible sudden death issues down there too, on the irrigated ground. Okay, and so for this study for 9 years, you've been hearing a lot about cover crop mixtures and things like that, and we'll get to that. We've got another study we'll be talking about, but in this one we're just looking at kind of categories of cover crops. And so one of our treatments is a non-legume, so a sorghum sedan. These are all planted after wheat harvest. Also then we planted a full season or a forage type soybean. Year to year it changed up a little bit, but always a real late maturing soybean. And then we had some winters. So we had a brassica, either winter canola for a couple of years, but since then it's been a radish. And then a legume. A couple of years of winter pea, had mixed success with that. We've been in the clover ever since for several years. And so the idea is, okay, we're putting these 6 different things in there. How does that affect our rotation? So here's the first, after one cycle of this. I said we started this in 2008, or in 2007, and so in 2008 we harvested the sorghum for the first time that was after cover crops. And there was such a heavy load of residual nitrogen in the profile that there was a 0 effect of anything that year, so I'm not including that. And so this is like the first year of sorghum in 2 years into the rotation. So in 2007, instead of cover crops, we maybe had sorghum on the plots, and then it went to beans, and then wheat, and back to the cover crops. And so it took a couple of years to get this in place. So this is averaged over 2 years, sorghum grown after one instance of the cover crops on these plots. And the black line in all these is going to be the chem fallow, so that's kind of our check. And in the sorghum piece, we had a range of nitrogen rates. So we had big strips, and we had all the way from 0 to 160 pounds of N applied to the sorghum after each of these 6 treatments, right? And so you can develop a nitrogen response curve. So here's the yield at 0 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, all the way up to 160 pounds of nitrogen, and we applied that fertilizer with a Coulter apparatus to get below or through the residue. So hopefully we're not tying up too much in that surface residue. So it's banded through the residue. What jumps out at you about this figure? If you're thinking, okay, this is our check, what's the first thing that you notice about it? Any of those lines jump out at you?
The red line starts out the lowest and meets up right with the chemical.
Right, so this red line really separates itself. That's that summer non-legume, the sorghum sedan. So at low nitrogen rates, it's pulling down the yield. Although, like you said, eventually it catches up. What do you think's going on? Why is it pulling down next year's sorghum yield when you have had that sorghum sedan ahead of that?
Using the same nutrients, it's about the same kind of plant, I guess.
Pardon me now?
I said it's about the same, the sorghum sedan and the milo, or they're the same kind of plant, using the same, they're different from the same barrel or whatever.
Right, so there's not much of a difference in crop type there, and that's a kind of a no-no. You want to change that up. So that's one thing, definitely. And they're using the same kind of nutrients, and they produce similar kinds of residue in that it's very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so it takes a lot of nitrogen to break it down, and so it'll immobilize nitrogen, kind of tie it up until you get enough out there that it can cycle it now again. And so this residue, we've measured it in other studies, ranges anywhere from 40 to 1 up to 50, 60 to 1, carbon to nitrogen ratio. And the ratio somewhere around 25 to 30 to 1 and below will mineralize nitrogen, release it, and greater than that, it'll immobilize it. And, you know, there's a transition zone in between there. Looks like we're immobilizing it. The fact that it'll yield similar to everything else with enough nitrogen, what does that tell you about the water situation? Or does it tell you anything? If you put enough N on, you about match the yields of everything else. Meaning nitrogen was probably the limiting factor here, not necessarily water. There's one way to interpret that, right? Okay, the other thing, this is the ugly maybe. This looks a little better up here, right? All these other treatments, and that includes the summer legume, that late maturing soybean, double crop soybeans, both of those winter cover crops, actually giving you a little bit of a yield bump at the low end rates, although by the time you get to about 80 pounds of N, there's not much differential there anymore. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so this would be the next cycle. So this is the average of the 2011, 12, and 13 seasons. And so these sorghum plots had seen cover crops twice. 2 cycles of that rotation, right? First of all, 0 to 160, 0 to 160, what do we know about this time span? 2011 to 13.
2011 was dry, wasn't it?
2011 was dry, 2012 was really dry, right? Like record dry. And so you average the yields out. 2013 we bounced back a little bit, but yeah, we're barely getting 100 bushel yields of average over that time span. Interesting enough, a couple of things. These 2 legumes, these are the 2 summer legumes. One's a cover crop and one's a double crop soybean. They're behaving about the way they did that first cycle, right? Giving us a little bit of a bump. The sorghum sedans may be pulling it down a little bit, but not as much, saying, okay, maybe now nitrogen isn't as big a deal. If you think about it, if you're only producing 80 to 100 bushel yields, it doesn't take as much nitrogen. And then look at this one. This is the winter legume. And so by this time we're using that clover. It tends to survive well into the winter. And look out here. Yeah, it's close, but it's pretty much at or below everything else everywhere, saying maybe there were, and especially in these years, maybe it was pulling water down and making water more limiting. Maybe we weren't measuring water during that time frame, but that's a clue. Okay, this is just our reminder. 2012 was hot. This is normal max temp. These are the 2012 numbers. Look how often it was above, well above normal. And the solid lines are the normal 3-week precip totals, and the dashed line is what we got. And yeah, there's some rain, but they really never peak close to the normal. And so it was hot and dry in 12. And so our yields were depressed. Brought things together, but if we look at sorghum yield, this is averaged across all the N rates. Only one treatment actually pulled down sorghum yield, and that was that winter legume. And that kind of makes sense, right? It's growing further closer to when you're planting that sorghum. The winter non-legume was equivalent. Everything else actually had better yields. Sorghum had better yields after all these other cover crops than after fallow, which supposedly would have stored the most of it. Even though they used water the previous season, something happened to still give them a little bit of a yield bump. This would have been soybeans grown in 2012. Yeah, not great yields, 20 bushel yields, but, and these are soybeans so they would have been a year after the cover crops, right? Actually 2 years. Sorghum was a year after the cover crops. Soybeans are 2 years after the cover crops. And in every situation, soybean yields were either the same as the system that had no cover crops, or maybe a slight increase. And then maybe, you got a sorghum sedan residue out there. That's the one that gave us the most persistent residue that hung around season to season. Maybe it's banking some soil moisture for us, I'm not sure. Oops. Look at the wheat yields that year. Now fairly respectable yields. The really dry didn't hit till later in the season. But it's a similar story in that never did the cover crops hurt the wheat in that tough year. In some cases it actually improved our wheat yields. in most other years, other than 2012, we couldn't pick up any effective cover crops. So in that tough year, we, it was either equal or maybe better. Most other years, it was kind of a wash. Okay, so then, done this 9 years now. This is the last round of it. So this sorghum, the plots where this sorghum had been planted, had seen cover crops 3 times. The immediate year before, and then in the rotation twice before that. Again, the sorghum sedan is pulling it down, although maybe not quite as tight up at the top, but probably within error. Interesting, here's the Kim fallow. That summer legume is still doing its thing, giving us a nice benefit at low wind rates. Kind of comes together at about 80 pounds. And these others are either the same as a Kim fallow or maybe pulling us down a little bit. And so what's going on there? Really the last 2 years, 15 and 16, are what are driving some of this. And so we're not exactly sure what's going on, but we're going to explore that a little bit. If you look at the whole 8 years of sorghum yield data, right, over 1, 2, and 3 cycles of the rotation, the legumes are giving us somewhere between 20 to 35 pounds of in terms of that rotation effect there, nitrogen equivalent. The winter covers are not having a minimal impact, and the sorghum sedan is actually pulling it down unless you pour the nitrogen to it. So there's maybe some indication we can manage our nitrogen a little differently or capture a little nitrogen benefit from legumes. Okay, so yeah, we've been able to make some inferences about water based on this yield response, but in a couple of years now, we've been actually measuring soil profile water. And so what we did is we went out into the 120 pound in rate. So what we wanted, we couldn't do this in every plot just because of the amount of time and effort and money involved, but we did it in this rate saying, okay, we're going to have a minimal impact of nitrogen up here, and that's a high but feasible nitrogen rate. And you go out, and we put these tubes in the ground down to, well, that first year we put them in about 5 foot deep. And there's an instrument then, put a plug on it, and we can go back out there periodically and drop this instrument in there, and it sends out a burst of radiation, so you got to have radiation training. And it, depending on how much water is in the soil around it, that affects how much bounces back and is sensed by a sensor on that instrument. And so that's where Gerard Klutenberg, this physicist that knows his math really well, you can convert that to water content of the soil at different depths. So you add that all up, and so here we harvested the wheat in June, planted the cover crops. As soon as it came up, we saw we had a good stand, put our tubes in and started taking measurements. And they started out pretty close together here, right? This is inches of water in the 5 foot profile. The black line is a Kim fallow plot. And so you can see that over the course of the cover crop growing season here, it gains a little water and then kind of levels off. Makes sense. Once it fills up, it can't gain any more water if you've got a no-till residue mat on top of that. All these other cover crops are using water, or pulling down the water. This is the winter legumes, so we planted them all, summer and winters. It didn't do too much. Everything else is pretty similar. So this would be mid-September, we terminated the full season soybean and the sorghum sedan. We rolled them down. And then we went on to double crop soybean harvest here in early November. You can see this is hanging in there, maybe gaining a little bit more. The winter clover is starting to pull down more, right? It's taking off and growing more as the cool temperatures. The sorghum sedan is recharging already. It's not growing so much. Recharging. The summer legume is recharging a little bit with that brassica. This is the winter, that's tillage radish here, but it's starting to separate itself out from the others. In other words, there's less water where that radish is compared to some of these others. All of them have less water than the Kim fallow in November when we cut the double crop beans. Forgot to mention these symbols here. That goes with that side and shows how many 1,000 pounds of biomass those produce. So what do we got here? Maybe a 1.5 tons and 3 tons from the forage beans and the sorghum sedan. And we're estimating about 1.5 tons from the double crop soybeans. Okay, let's go through here to winter. We let the frost in the winter take out the tillage radish and the crimson clover. They didn't survive all the way to spring, but it got tough enough to take them out, and things are all sloping up, right? Although it's starting to sort out a little bit. Greatest extraction here with the radish, least where that sorghum sedan was. So you got that big mat there, and it seems to be able to capture and hold more water than maybe some of the other treatments. Can't point this out, but this is cumulative precip. Every time you see a bump, we got a rain, right? Over time, that goes with this axis as well. So yeah, you get some decent fall rains, fairly dry over the late fall, a little bit of, that was the year we had a pretty wet December. Take it all the way to May. We're going to pull the tubes up and plant sorghum. Everything has come back together. And look, we've had some pretty good spring rains and continued to have good spring rain. And by that time, there's just as much water under where the cover crops have been as where we didn't have cover crops. And it didn't matter which cover crop. So that was the summer 2014 cover crops, all the way to spring of 2015, we're ready to plant sorghum.
And nothing is still living, all the cover crops were dead by then?
Yeah, either we terminated them or the winter took them out.
Okay.
Yeah, and we got in early spring and did some burn down to keep the mare's tail and volunteer wheat down. Yep.
On that double crop soybean, so what's that mean, you had another crop soybean before that? Or did you
No.
put that in that terminated cover crop?
No, they're two different treatments.
Okay.
It's just another treatment right beside the other cover crops, but it's after, they're all planted about the same time.
But that double crop soybean, was that planted into some rolled cover
No,
crop?
no,
Different-
they were
different
planted the same time as all the other cover
Okay.
crops after wheat harvest, yeah.
field? Okay.
But we harvested them for grain here in early November. But I'm just saying, at this point, based on the grain yield, we're estimating about, in a harvest index of about 0.5, we're estimating about, 1.5 tons of total biomass. And yeah, the two winters, only about 1 ton or a little more than 1 ton of biomass production, so not a lot. But those are hard to estimate because, when do you sample them? They kind of keep growing, and if you wait till they're dead, then some of it's already kind of died. But so we didn't have tremendous growth, but reasonable growth. This is the next year, so we grew the sorghum, and we'll look at that in a little bit. Well, we've already looked at the yields, right? This is down to 9 feet. We were doing some other work that made us think we got to go deeper than 5 feet because there's stuff going on deeper than that, we're thinking. And I didn't mention this is on a Weimar. Anybody have Weimar soils? kind of soil, yeah, some nodding back there. Kind of soils you on your upland or intermediate soils? Does it get kind of some clay before you get very deep?
Yeah, mostly does.
That's what this Wymore is like, you know, pretty decent silt loam, but it doesn't take long, you got a lot of clay. And that's what this is like. So I think there are variations of that in a lot of the soils on these hills, and some of them are more clay, especially as you get up on the tops. And you know, you get down in some bottom ground, you get a pretty deep silt loam. But this is on, by the time you get a foot to 18 inches deep, you're starting to increase clay content pretty good on this. Okay, so we harvested the cover crops, planted them, rained, it took us a while, and by the time we got the tubes in and got measuring the soil water, there was already some extraction, right? And pretty good extraction here when we terminated those summer covers in September. A lot more cover crop growth, right? So now we're looking at, what is that, 6 to 7 tons from the sorghum sedan, and you know, maybe 4 tons from the forage soybeans. And so, yeah, growing a lot of biomass, pulling a lot of water out of the profile. Harvested double crop beans a little earlier in October this year. Good bean yields, and we're estimated a couple of tons to maybe 2.5 tons of dry matter. Everything's kind of recharging, but see, we had some good rains in that time period, September. Get here into January where everything kind of shut down, so now we kind of put the crimson clover and tillage radish termination about the same time. Everything's recharging, although that crimson clover pulled it down pretty good for a while, but got a lot of rain, recharged pretty nicely. But again, that tillage radish is staying kind of low. If you take it through, here we went in early May to pull the tubes out. There's still some separation there this time. So we're going down to 9 feet. And these have a little bit less water than the chem fallow. Now, after we pull them out, we got another good chunk of rain here, so it could have come together. But what was interesting then was what's going on with depth at this point. So these next 2 figures, we're going to be looking at soil profile water at this point in 2015, spring of 2015, and at this point in the spring of 2016. So this is 2015. Pulled those tubes out, we're about ready to plant sorghum. We only went to about 5 feet. And this is the one they all came together, right? This is that same number. Total profile water is pretty similar across all of these. But you've got a little bit more water at the surface where you have cover crop residue. Makes sense. Maybe a little extraction or less water as you get deeper. So the distribution of water in that profile has changed a little bit, even though the total quantity is similar. The next year, we actually had that separation. And so less water where we had cover crops compared to the chem fallow. And again, it follows a similar pattern, although what we're looking at here, I didn't explain this. This is depth, right? Surface of the soil down to 8.5 feet. And this is water content. So to the right is wetter, to the left is drier. So anything with a cover crop at the surface, or most things, are a little bit wetter. Get a little bit depth here. This is 1.5 feet, 2 feet, maybe some extraction. By the time you get to 4.5 feet, there's some noticeable extraction. This year we had the deep tubes in. Look what's going on down deep. Even though it's a pretty heavy clay soil, especially these brassicas are pulling water out. And then that winter legume, right? Taproot grows well into the winter. forage soybean actually had the least extraction at depth. And so, yeah, we had extraction, but it was way deep. And when we look at our grain yields from the sorghum, this is what we saw at that 120 pound nitrogen rate where we're taking these water readings. Ignore these for a little bit. This is the yield. Pretty similar yields, maybe a little bit of a hit with the sorghum sedan, maybe a little bit of a hit with the radish. These are other measures of sorghum growth. This is how many days to half bloom, where we're growing the sorghum after the sorghum sedan. It was later to bloom, a few days. SPAD reading at heading, that measures how green the leaves are, basically. How much chlorophyll. It's an indicator of nitrogen uptake, really. Yeah, we're limiting nitrogen where we have the sorghum sedan, no other effect. And then this is a green seeker NDVI. It's kind of a similar reading, but this is done even earlier. It measures leaf greenness, but also amount of growth. And it's just one of these things. They have them on fertilizer, some fertilizer spreaders where you can do on-the-fly adjustments, that kind of a thing. But again, showing that we're limiting nitrogen, but not limiting yield or the greenness of the canopy. This was the year where their water all came together by the time we pulled those tubes out. This was the year where there was a little bit more separation. Similar response during the season. Not much effect unless you were after sorghum sedan. Delayed heading. Worse yield after the sorghum sedan, but maybe a little bit of a reduction in yield for those tillage radish, but it's pretty minimal.
To me, the tillage radish is supposed to be the big deal, sending down the tubers and everything, get more water in there. Well, it's always one of your higher use ones, it seems like. And next to the sorghum sedan, it's always using more water. Next one to use more water.
Yeah, but it's doing it way deep here. That's where the big difference is. You know, up at the surface, it recharges. And so the question is, yes, it's using more water. As you move into the growing season, is this going to be a big deal for your sorghum or whatever your next crop is, right? Our sorghum yields are saying, not much of a deal, maybe a little bit, but not much. And so, yeah, maybe it's in a very dry year, the sorghum after those tillage radish was equal to Kim fallow, not worse.
Well, when we started cover crops, we said, well, use the radishes, you're gonna get more water. Well, it's never more or above it, it's always a little bit less on your chart.
It is.
It just says, to me, it isn't doing what it should be doing, I don't think.
And, you know, maybe we're not measuring it long enough. One of the things, though, if you think about this, though, if you've got less water here, and you're ready to plant sorghum, those little sorghum plants aren't using much water initially, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, the problem is at the surface, everything's kind of similar, and that's where the infiltration really happens. But this, in some ways, this might actually provide a reservoir for, okay, this to move on down and let more water in. So as a system, you're making space for more. And we saw that in another study where we had a corn-soybean rotation where we had the cover crops and we're measuring runoff, and the cover crops had less runoff because they made room in that profile for water benefit. So just because there's less water doesn't mean it's a bad thing or not. It depends on the year. So, I mentioned this earlier, soybean and wheat, really not much effect of the cover crops. In that drought year, sorghum yields were equal or better if the summer or double crops were in there. Our wheat and soybean yields were actually equal or better with the cover crops, regardless of what they were. And I think I mentioned this already, if we could get nearly the same yield just by adding in, water's not a limiting factor most of the time. And this is over that 8-year period, including 2012, 2011. And so, yeah, I think individual cases it could be a factor, but in our environments around here, over time, it tends not to be. Okay, how many of you are growing some kind of a mixture? Yeah, radishes, oats, you mentioned some other things.
Winter rye and
Okay.
turnips. Turnips are cheap to plant. I mean, I was wondering about if I can go back about the rates, like when you had a sorghum, or are you using like a, how many pounds of radishes are you planning to have, to get it in your study? Or how many pounds of
Yeah.
brown midrib or whatever you're doing?
Right, so, well, let's just look at one of these. So the sorghum Sudan, we're planting somewhere around 20 pounds, I believe.
So that's quite a bit though.
That's a pretty good rate.
Yeah,
And my main goal is to have a nice even stand in my little plot.
I got you.
You know, I don't have the luxury of kind of having a spot here and there.
Right, okay.
But, so I aim for the high end typically, but yeah, it's 15 to 20 pounds. The clovers are in that 18-pound high end.
The clovers and stuff are kind of hard to get established, aren't they? And slow to get started?
They're very slow starting. These winter legumes in general,
Yeah,
unless they happen, like a couple of times those winter peas survived, and if they did, they put on nice growth in the spring. But oftentimes they didn't, and you just didn't get much with the fall growth.
mhm.
And the clovers, again, if they survive, they can give you something nice in the spring, but if not, I'd like to plant them a little bit earlier now because you at least have a chance to get more fall growth out of them. The radishes, I think somewhere around 8 pounds, so pretty high rate.
Pretty high rates, yes,
Yeah, I
okay.
mean, you can go as low as 2, 3, 4 pounds, depending, especially if you're in a mixture, a couple of pounds is plenty.
And we're planting one in our mixtures.
Yeah, right. And so this is putting it to it, I guess. Yeah. And so, yeah, if you don't have as dense a stand, maybe you still have those channels, but you don't have as much extraction. I don't know how that all balances out. So the idea here is, one of the things I like about mixtures is they're kind of like wheat variety blends, right? The idea behind that is if one variety doesn't do well, or one species doesn't do well, the other one will make up for it. And we've got data, and there's data in the literature that will say cover crop blends work about the same way. There's also the benefit of, you know, one of the reasons we're liking cover crops is you got more diversity in your system, right? Different crop types. Not only now do you have diversity from crop to crop, but you got it within the cover crop. So that's kind of nice. We really set this up specifically to look at soil water and specifically to look at mixture complexity. So we had single species, simple mixtures, and complex mixtures. We'll talk about them a little bit. And then we planted corn after that, the next year. So how does corn differ from sorghum in terms of sensitivity to water? A little more responsive, I would say, right? So that was one of the ideas there. So we did this at Manhattan and Belleville in 13-14, and then again in 14-15. Manhattan's at Wymore. Belleville's at Creek Silt Loam. We'll talk about the treatments here. Kind of like that previous study, we harvested the wheat, didn't till or anything, drilled the cover crops into the stubble. And these were mostly summers, so we kind of terminated them in that September time frame. put these, this is what that access tube looks like. That's about 6 inches of tube sticking out of the ground. And then you can come along, pull that stopper off, lower that thing in there, and take your readings. So these are the treatments. So we had the fallow in there again, right? We had 2 grasses, a sorghum sudan and a pearl millet. Pearl millet's nice grazing. Regrows. A couple of brassicas, tillage radish again, and then Winford rape. A couple of legumes, a red clover and sun hemp, which is more of a heat tolerant summer one. And then we took these and we took one of each class to make a 3-way mix, sorghum sudan, tillage radish, clover. And then we took the other of each class to make another 3-way mix of pearl millet, Winford radish, and sun hemp. And then we put all 6 of those together. So we got a 6-way mix. And each time we're adjusting the seeding rates proportionally to how many things are going in it, right? And these, we probably didn't push the seeding rates quite as much as in that other study. They were a little more reasonable. And then we had a 9-way mix that had a number of these things, but it kind of was built to mimic what you could get on online commercial. So, let's first look at, okay, how much production did we get out of these things, the sorghum or the grasses? We're just looking at the classes here. The grasses produced the most. This is Manhattan in 13. Brassicas and legumes quite a bit less. You see this brown section above there? It's volunteer wheat. So that year we cut the wheat and it was dry, and so we wanted to get a rain, get a little flush of volunteer wheat and weeds and spray it and then plant. And it stayed dry. And it stayed dry. So we said we got to plant. So we went out and planted, and then it rained and the volunteer wheat came on like gangbusters. And so we did, all we had was volunteer wheat at Belleville in 13, so we're not even, don't even have results from that. The mixtures, you can see here it's split up. This is the grass component, the brassica component, and then the legume component. In most cases, the grasses are dominating this. We adjusted seeding rates proportionately, but those grasses are C4 grasses. They do well in the heat, jump right out. Not a real pattern here in terms of mixture complexity, in terms of productivity. The next year at Manhattan, kind of similar, much more productive, almost 4 tons of production. Again, the mixture's dominated by the grasses and kind of mimic what the grass is doing. Although here it looks like the more complex mixture, the slightly less production. But again, kind of between the most productive component and the least productive component. Belleville, very similar picture to what we saw at Manhattan. These are the C/N ratio numbers I was talking about. And so you see the grasses, high C/N, they're going to almost suck up nitrogen out of the system until it gets enough to break that down. Legumes and brassicas, very similar, low. They'll release it much more quickly. And then these mixtures, kind of intermediate, right? It's a mixture of those things. All a little bit lower in 2014, it just had to do with the year and maybe things were not as far along in development. Those numbers tend to go up as things get more mature. But the pattern is the same, and same at Belleville. Lower C/N, likely going to turn over nitrogen much more rapidly. Higher C/N, especially if you have a straight grass. So we did 9-foot profiles here at Manhattan, similar to what we were looking at. This total inches of water in that 9-foot of profile. Planted the cover crops. Took us a while to get in there and get tubes in. For whatever reason, it looks like we had more water where we had cover crops, but we had some good rains there. Maybe there's already enough to suppress evaporation, I don't know. But eventually sucked down the water, terminated the cover crops in mid-September, so once they're dead, and this time we just sprayed everything with 2,4-D Roundup mix. And that's bouncing back, you know, you get a rain, everything goes up. But look at these brassicas. Remember what we saw in that other study? Less profile water in those brassicas all the way until we're ready to pull the tubes to plant corn. The grasses and the legumes intermediate, and the mixtures kind of mimic what the grasses are doing. Maybe a pattern here. Here's the most simple mixture, the 3-way, 6-way, 9-way. Probably within error there, but a little bit of a pattern is less water after the 9-way. But if you look at Manhattan, the next year that pattern does not hold. Similar drawdown, determination, recharge, comes back. That year there's separation. This year things come together. Looks like some of these anyway are recharging, except where you have the brassicas and the legumes, and this time the sun hemp was really driving what was going on there in the legumes. And again, the pattern is different. Now you got this 9-way with the least water drawdown, and the 6-way and the 3-way with the most. Kind of bouncing around where the grass, that dominant component is. So we pull the tubes out, getting ready to plant corn. Belleville, here we only went down to 5 feet. A couple of reasons for that. One, we only had so many 9-foot tubes. And the other is, Lloyd Stone's done a lot of work up here saying that on those crete soils, there's not a lot of root activity, at least in corn production, below about a meter, meter and a half. 4 to 5 feet. Again, a similar pattern, draw down, although you have a big rain here, it kind of goes up, draws it down, terminate it. Similar pattern what we saw here, right? The grasses and the mixtures kind of cluster together a little bit below the Kim fallow, whereas the brassicas and that sun hemp legume with a deep taproot look like they're extracting more water. Pulled the tubes here in April, we're ready to plant corn, but look what's going on. Raining. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's do like we did the last time, and let's say, okay, at this point, in each of these 3 locations, what's going on through the profile? So this is that first year at Manhattan, and we had a little bit of separation from the Kim fallow, right? The brassicas had the least water. The mixtures were kind of spread across there. Like we saw in the other one, everything seems to have recharged near surface, but more extraction with depth, especially as you go deep, these brassicas are pulling the water out. Also some of the grasses. The next year at Manhattan, this is total inches of water in the profile. Again, it's a little different pattern here in terms of the mixture, so we can't conclude much about the effect of mixture complexity on water use. My conclusion is it really approximates the dominant component or the mixture of components going into that. More water near surface if you have the cover crops, but as you move deeper and deeper, it tends to pull away, although not as much way deep here that year, right, compared to this year. Then at Belleville, kind of a similar pattern. Recharge near surface, extraction, and here once you get below about 2 feet, there's more extraction. Okay, so yeah, they all used some water, right? Relative to the fallow. And the mixture complexity really approximated, the response approximated what happened with the dominant component, the grass in this case, or the mixture, whatever was contributing to that mixture. Most of the time things rebounded, especially near surface, right? But depending on what was in there, especially the brassicas and the legumes, saw some persistent extraction deep in the profile. So now we're gonna grow corn. Same plots. Manhattan, both years, we got the corn in a reasonable time. Remember I showed you, we pulled the tubes and it was raining in Belleville, and it kept raining, and we didn't get in there until well into June to plant the corn. So we backed off the hybrid maturity. We're pushing the seeding rates for dry land. Anybody grow corn? What are you dropping?
25.
25?
28,
Yeah.
26.
Yeah, so this is on the high end of it, but we wanted to push it. Put on a reasonable end rate. Didn't want to necessarily overwhelm it, but we didn't want end to be real limiting either. Okay, so during the corn then, we put tubes in just in the Kim fallow and where we had those brassicas that had the most extraction deep, right? We didn't have enough tubes to do them all. But we could follow those extremes. And so we plant the corn here in April, get the tubes in, start taking readings. This is total profile water. You can pick up the differential we saw at the end of the cover crop period, now that the corn's growing. And look at that, it stayed there all season long, even though we had some pretty good rains here in June. The combination of this pretty long period here where not all that much rain and that 30,000 seed drop hurried us to black layer here in the middle of August. And so that was our last water reading there. Things were pretty well done using water at that point. The next year, planted the corn about the same time, took us a little longer to get the tubes in, but a similar situation. That profile water differential persisted throughout the season. Here a more reasonable early September black layer. So yeah, holy cow, what's going on with these radishes, right? It's drier underneath there. Belleville was different. Didn't plant it until June. As a matter of fact, it was also different in that instead of spraying those cover crops, we mowed them down just because we didn't have facilities to spray them there. So we mowed them down. And in that case, everything recharged. And if anything, might be what you're saying, the typical thinking, we actually had more water where we had the brassicas during the corn crop. But yeah, it was a pretty wet year that year.
When did you mow them down there?
In the fall, about mid to late September.
See, those there, they'd go till frost, right?
Well, we sprayed them in mid-September,
Oh.
as they were just starting to shoot heads out of the sorting system. So they were terminated about the same time, but just a slightly different way here. Yeah. So what do you think's going to happen to corn yield? Any guesses? Remember what your corn was like in 14 and 15? Not bad years. I don't know. Depends. Okay, during the corn crop then, let's just look, we're going to look at this date and this date in the profile. And so yeah, you look at the profile, there's less water where the tillage radish was, but it's the same all the way down to 2.5 feet. It's just down deep where that separation occurs. If you look at black, so we're black layer of the corn now. Yeah, there's less water, it's drier, but not much differential. If you draw a line at about 4 feet, oops, all of these points move to the left, meaning they got drier during the corn growth. And that makes sense, you got corn roots exploring. All of those points below 4 feet got wetter, meaning there's not a whole lot, this year there was not a whole lot of corn rooting down deep. The next year at Manhattan, kind of a similar picture. Wetter at the surface, still though a differential down deep. Again, things came together over the season, and this time you could go down to 6 feet and say, okay, everything 6 feet and above got drier during the corn growth. The brassica plots actually got wetter, and the Camphalo plots got a little bit drier over that period. So I'm not sure what that tells us about corn rooting depth, other than, yeah, maybe things are just kind of evening out down below there. Right? Belleville, this is where things had come together, and yeah, there's not much separation. Either at the beginning of the corn growth or by the end of corn growth, everything got a little bit drier. Don't know what happened deep because we didn't have the long tubes there, but if you look at this, these circles are placed on the exact same place in each chart, indicating there's not much change to the left. Yeah, it gets a little drier, but not much, leading me to believe that maybe there isn't all that much going on that deep on that soil. Okay, this is what happened to corn yield. Here's our fallow, and if we put a line on here, that's the error bar. Everything here had essentially the same yield, and that includes corn grown after those brassica plots that maintained a differential in soil water content. So water wasn't the problem. All of these had a slight ding to the corn yield, dominated by grasses. And how are all of these different than these? Wasn't water, right? All of these in terms of soil water fell between this and this by the time you got to the corn. What was different here?
More combination of seeds, or?
Yeah, well, this is the
Or
single
higher.
grasses, single species, but yeah, you had mixtures, but the grasses behaved about the same. And remember, the grasses are the dominant component of these mixtures, and that all had a higher C/N ratio. I think it's similar to what we saw in the sorghum. It's the residue composition affecting yield, not the soil water. And so when you're grazing it, you're probably addressing a lot of this by getting some of that residue out there, mixing it up, and that kind of a thing, and helping yourself out, probably.
So you're suggesting if we put another 40 pounds in on, the yields?
Could well have done just as well. Next year in Manhattan, we had that thing shut down early, not great yields, pretty good yields. The next year, almost the exact same pattern, right?
If we had cows out there eating them mixes, they turn some of that into manure, into nitrogen.
Yep. That would be interesting to get numbers on, but there's a very good chance that goes a long ways to addressing some of this issue that we're seeing here. Yeah. Belleville was different. Look at that. Everything with a cover crop was either the same as the fallow or better. And so that was different. We mowed the cover crops. Corn was planted a lot later, and it was a shorter maturity corn. Water, yeah, we already saw water was not an issue here, right? And as a matter of fact, doesn't look like this nitrogen immobilization thing was an issue either. And maybe the timing, this is pushing quite a bit later.
Pardon me, were there any big rain events where a lot of water would have run off in one of the treatments? And more of it would have been percolating down in the soil? I mean, was there a big 5-inch rain along any of those?
Yeah, in this one, I know there was not. In 2014, and let's just look at that.
I didn't see it, but that one bottom line was the rainfall events, right?
Yeah, okay, so here's the rainfall during the corn. Are you thinking of during the corn or during the cover crop?
Yeah, well, if the cover crop, I was just wondering what other benefits there might be. That's what I'm thinking
Yeah,
about.
right. So So here's the
That's
big
pretty good
ring.
rain right
Yeah.
there.
That would be, yeah, a 2-inch rain maybe. After that, not that much. This year, no big events, but kind of steady. This year, some pretty good events, right? You get to the corn. There's a pretty good rainfall there. There's a pretty good rain. There's a pretty good rain. So yeah, that likely had some runoff on some of these. And that is, we don't have a way to measure that, you know? I do know that most of the time, it's not like a lot of residue moved around out there. It was, stayed pretty good.
One of those big old turnip, or tillage radishes though, has a pretty big divot.
Yeah.
A lot of, I mean, you know, they, I don't know if there's a value to it or not.
Although you don't find it too far into that next crop. At least we couldn't. Okay, I think we're about winding it down. Looking at the corn yield, that was a different year. And so, yeah, managing your, either your fertility or that residue in a way to, yeah, by taking, if you're grazing it, you're taking out a lot of that high CDN stuff. And if you're mixing it with legumes and things, the more legumes and brassicas you mix in, the higher that CDN will be, and it'll cycle more quickly. So yeah, we're showing water use. Mixture complexity really didn't, I would say it just kind of approximates what's going into that mixture. Yeah, brassicas and those deep, sometimes we saw evidence that those taprooted legumes are pulling water from pretty deep in the profile. And those water differences persisted. But in the years, yeah, 14 and 15 was when we grew the corn here, didn't look like water affected grain yield, at least not in terms of a limiting factor. Belleville? Yeah, I don't know. Was the fact that these were here, you know, the brassicas was actually one that did not really increase yield that much. Everything else had more yield. And this is just a reminder, that's where we did the work. And that's more for when I talk about this further away from Manhattan, so. Other thoughts or comments?
Do any work with regard to soil temperature on cover crops versus conventional till or no cover?
I have not taken soil, okay. We've done some work looking at soil temperature in, and here we were looking at canola establishment.